Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the great privilege of serving as director of Roosevelt House. It's my pleasure, on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College, to welcome all of you this evening back for another virtual Roosevelt House presentation online. As many of our regular attendees are aware, and we're enormously pleased and proud, Roosevelt House has remained quite active during this ongoing period of isolation and lockdown, with a series of events offering the Roosevelt House perspective on the challenges of this historic time in our country. In the last few weeks alone, we've hosted more than 2,000 attendees for discussions of journalism's role in protecting democracy, of Eleanor Roosevelt's evolution into an icon of human rights, the history of the leadership of the CIA, and just last week, a conversation with US Senator Sherrod Brown from the battleground state of Ohio on the history and future of progressivism. Tonight, we turn to a relatively new frontier of policymaking: cybersecurity and the cyber conflicts, past and present, that will help shape the future of geopolitical engagement. To guide us through these new realities is prize-winning New York Times national security correspondent, author, and documentary filmmaker David E. Sanger. For nearly 4 decades, in roles including Tokyo Bureau Chief, Washington Economic Correspondent, White House Correspondent, and Chief of the Washington Bureau, David has provided critical reporting for the New York Times on the most vital national security subjects, from nuclear proliferation to the topic of today's talk, the rise of cyber conflict. His groundbreaking reporting on one of the most sophisticated and frightening cyber attacks in history, which he revealed as having originated with the US to sabotage Iran's nuclear program, became the subject of the Peabody Award-winning documentary, 0 Days. Among his many distinctions and honors, David has won Pulitzer Prizes as a key member of 3 different investigative teams, most recently in 2017 for international reporting. Before that, as a part of the team that shined light on struggles within the Clinton administration over controlling technology exports to China, and also as a leading member of the team that probed the causes of the Challenger shuttle disaster back in 1986. He's the author of 2 bestsellers on policy and national security. One is The Inheritance: The World Obama Confronts and the Challenges to American Power, and also Confront and Conceal: Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power. I'm also happy to say that I quoted David Sanger in my own new book, in which he talked, in the quote I used, about the most closed administration with the press in American history. I will leave it to readers of the book, so I can stop short of kind of a self-promotional advertisement. I'll leave it to you to guess or read about which administration David was talking about. He visits tonight as executive producer of the new HBO documentary, The Perfect Weapon, in which he also makes frequent and insightful appearances, and of course, author of the 2018 book on which the film is based. The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, now in an updated paperback edition with an all-new chapter bringing the story close to the present day. In The Perfect Weapon, David meticulously tracks the emergence of cyber conflict as the primary way large and small countries are competing and undercutting each other, and in so doing, changing the nature of global power. As you would expect, the documentary adaptation of David's book has also been updated to reflect the many concerns about foreign election interference, providing in many ways a critical warning against the threat of interference in the election that's occurring now. To engage with David about this timely topic, we're delighted also to welcome executive producer and director of The Perfect Weapon, John Maggio. John is an Emmy Award-winning producer, director, and writer whose films and documentary series include Korea, The Never-Ending War, Panic, The Untold Story of the 2008 Financial Crisis, The Newspaper Man, The Life and Times of Ben Bradley, several episodes of the Italian Americans and American Experience, and the documentary Looking for Lincoln, in which I had the pleasure of appearing among the Lincoln historians on air. So John, it's very good to see you again. I also remember your work on the Italian Americans, because as I recall, it included my old boss, Mario Cuomo. So thank you, David and John, for speaking with us tonight on a crucial subject and on your extraordinary new film. And thank you also to all of our attendees for joining us this evening. As always, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask your questions. You can start posing them as soon as the program goes live, and they will be answered at the end of the program with a curated question and answer session moderated by our own Mac Barrett. Also, to purchase a copy of David's book, The Perfect Weapon, keep an eye on the chat function on your screen, where we will share a link to purchase it along with an autographed book plate from our bookstore, Shakespeare and Company. And with all that, please welcome David Sanger in conversation with John Maggio.
Well, thank you, Harold, and thank you to Roosevelt House for having me and John here tonight, just a few days before the presidential election, to discuss this project that we've been teammates on for some time. It's a real pleasure to be back at Roosevelt House. I wish we could be in the beautiful auditorium there, but one day we will all make it back to something resembling more normal life, I hope, and I hope we do that soon. It's a real pleasure to be here, though, with my friend John, who did an extraordinary job, I think, taking a complex subject, cyber conflict, something that doesn't usually lend itself to great visuals, and to turn out what I thought was a really compelling documentary, and we'll talk soon about how it is that he managed to do that. John, I see you there from the office over at Art Media with your movie posters behind you, but thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, David, and thank you to Harold. I remember fondly our time together on Looking for Lincoln. You not only were a really generous participant on camera, but were invaluable to me and to the whole production team in trying to kind of take a fresh look at Lincoln and his legacy today. So I really appreciate it. And it's wonderful to be here with you and with everybody in the audience. So I think what we should do, David, is maybe get everybody caught up on your latest reporting, which just, I think, appeared in the New York Times today, if I'm correct, as a way to kind of start off where we are now with the cyber war, and then we can dig into the book and the film.
Oh, great idea, John. So as I needn't say, we're 4 days and 12 hours out. And perhaps what's most remarkable about the cyber conflict so far is that we have all been obsessed with Russia. The first actor we saw move in a significant way was actually Iran. Iran was behind those emails sent to a number of voters, several hundred voters in Florida and in Alaska last week, and perhaps some other places, that in the end turned out not to really be based on a hack, but largely on public information. It wasn't, John, the smoothest cyber operation I've ever seen. These sort of clunkily worded emails that pretended to be from the Proud Boys, the far right group, threatened voters, said, we know that you're registered as a Democrat. We'll know how you vote if you don't vote for Donald Trump, and so forth and so on. If you read them, it looked a little bit like they had been composed by the scriptwriters for the Borat movie. But they were
Which is a great part of the deception, though, too, right? I mean,
yeah, right. And they were very quickly attributed back to Iran. The more interesting thing that's been going on, though, John, has been an effort by United States Cyber Command, which we'll be talking about a little bit later on, to try to send some advanced shots over the bow of the Russian groups, particularly those led by the GRU, the military intelligence unit, that was responsible for the hack and leaks in 2016, which we recount in the film, was responsible for the release of a lot of the information that came from John Podesta's emails and things from the Clinton campaign. The effort was to keep these groups and related Russian groups from conducting next week what could be the biggest fear out of all of this, which is ransomware attacks. We saw both Cyber Command moving stealthily, but not that stealthily, and Microsoft and a number of other companies operating from Microsoft's cyber crimes unit, where you filmed part of the documentary, to try to dismantle a large botnet called TrickBot. This is a set of tools used by Russian-speaking ransomware hackers. We don't know that they work for the government. In order to get into both private and corporate email and some cities and towns in an effort to lock up their computer systems and then demand a ransom. And the fear remains, that they would do this around Election Day to lock up the registration systems, the websites of secretaries of state, the people who go and report the results, because this can lead to a perception hack. And a perception hack, John, as we spent some time dealing with in the film, is a hack that does not have to be across the entire state of Wisconsin or Minnesota or Pennsylvania or any other battleground state, but that if you can hack into a few districts, a few cities, do something that makes big headlines, you can create the impression that you've hacked the entire state, the whole infrastructure. And that's a particularly worrisome thing at a time that we've got the president already tweeting out, as he has for months now, that this election will be rigged, that it's subject to foreign interference, the exact opposite argument he made in 2016, and that he would call out any evidence of bias against him. And clearly, he said as much at a rally a few weeks ago. He is looking for a moment to take some of these to the courts or to Congress if it looks as if he is narrowly losing. And that's why there are very different scenarios right now that people are preparing for, if it's a decisive win on either side, or if it's very close, as most of the elections of the past 20 years have been. And in fact, John, I think we've got a clip ready from The Perfect Weapon, don't we? Why don't you talk a little bit about what
why
this
don't we,
one
I
is?
think this is a perfect time. In many ways, there are so many different kind of cyber, quote unquote, cyber attacks that we cover in the film of different nature that we'll get into. One's on critical infrastructure, worms, ransomware, but this is the idea of a perception hack. I find the most intriguing, the most troubling in a way. It's also the hardest to combat, and maybe the kind of thing that America, with our open society and public square and First Amendment, is most vulnerable to, more so than our adversaries. So what I would love to do is and we saw a great example of this. That the election's only days away. We don't need to look too far. If we look at the Iowa caucuses, I think we saw a great example of the kind of frenzy we can turn ourselves into around just the perception that Russia might be involved in the hacking. So if we can, I'd love to show the clip number 3 about perception hack, and then we'll discuss.
Iowa was exactly my worst fear.
The biggest concern was that voters would not be able to trust the system.
What about the confidence in the vote?
Especially against the backdrop of the Russian interference in 2016.
What Iowa is demonstrating to adversaries in the United States is all they have to do is create that appearance, and they probably don't even have to create their own disinformation. American partisans will do it for them.
The president's son was saying it's rigged. The president's campaign manager. The Biden campaign is out there openly saying they don't trust what the results will be.
They've created what's called a perception hack. Our mind immediately goes to the question, are the Russians messing with our election? It doesn't matter whether they are or they aren't.
This is one of the confusing aspects of election security. It's not just about trying to hack into computers. There's another aspect of election interference that's about trying to hack into your brain. They're ultimately trying to get the American people to lose confidence in the system, that the system is beyond repair, that the system is broken, and their vote doesn't matter.
Now, I mean, that's incredible to me. This was, and we can talk a little bit about this, but this was really just a faulty app. This was a.
There were no Russians involved in this one.
Absolutely no Russians involved, and they should have pressure tested the app. The maker got excited, and it sent us into a tailspin for 48 hours. It felt like, and that's what worries me about this upcoming election. With all of the disinformation that's been put out there, all of the rhetoric from the White House, from the president about this being rigged and what he will accept and not accept. This is what keeps me up at night. Does it keep you up at night? I mean, is it a concern that you have about?
It certainly is. We spent a lot of time worrying about the big hack. The hack that hits the voting machines and so forth. That could happen, but as we discuss in the documentary, John, and as I think many people know now, the one advantage of our crazy patchwork election system, in which every state has a different system and frequently different machines, and sometimes within a state there are different systems, is that it's so old, so backwards, and so discombobulated that it's actually difficult to hack. So instead, the concern is about the registration systems, which are forward facing. There, you can sit down at your computer and go on the internet and go sign up, which means it's internet connected, unlike the voting machines, which means someone can change it, some data in there. And if you're looking for a good piece of evidence of this, check in with Ron DeSantis, the Republican governor of Florida, who showed up to vote on Monday and discovered that somebody had gone into his registration and moved him from Tallahassee to West Palm Beach, a good number of miles, a good several hundred miles away. Now, the governor was able to vote anyway, and a 20-year-old was arrested fairly quickly for going in and manipulating the system. But the big question isn't who did it, it's why was it so easy for a 20-year-old to go in and pretend he was the governor of Florida and change his registration system? And if he could do it so easily, you can't think that it would be much of a challenge for the GRU or for the Iranian Cyber Corps or for the North Koreans' cyber team. Sort of remarkable that 4 years after our experience in 2016, that Florida couldn't figure out a better way to secure its registration system, particularly for high-profile voters.
And one of the, in one of those cases that we cover in the film about ransomware, which is, obviously one of the things that's keeping current DHS officials up at night, was, we see in Baltimore, in 2019 with the attack there. And the idea that, a country, an individual, a criminal, whatever, could hold a municipality hostage just at the time when they needed to tally their votes or loosen up their election machinery, and that they wouldn't be able to do it without paying a ransom is just, it feels like we're this close to that kind of reality. I mean, if a 20-year-old could do it to DeSantis, I mean, what are we seeing? Are we seeing anything like that in early voting?
Where we've seen one big case in recent times. So the ransomware against Baltimore, which we were described in the film, and you see some of the damage done there, against Atlanta, against some small towns in Florida and Texas last summer, were all aimed at some of the basic infrastructure of the towns and cities. It made it hard for them to issue building permits and collect taxes and settle your parking fines and, you know, just the day-to-day stuff you do with the city or town. But we saw a similar attack just a week ago, less than a week ago, on Gainesville, Florida. Don't ask me why all these things are happening in Florida, but shades of 2002. Gainesville had an attack not based against it or not directed against its election system, but just against the town. Apparently refused to pay the ransom. So two things have happened. First, among the things that were locked up was not the registration system, but the signature verification software system that verifies your signature when you mail in a mail-in ballot. And, you know, they want to compare the John Maggio signature now versus what was on your card. Now, it didn't stop anybody from voting. They went back to the old-fashioned way. They brought in a bunch of people and they pulled the cards from the registration system, but it didn't make you feel all that good. And then yesterday, according to this morning's Wall Street Journal, a website appeared that posted a bunch of the information that the hackers had pulled out, probably as a warning to Gainesville that it was time to pay their ransomware. Some of it was public information, but some of it were social security numbers and other internal emails and so forth to show that the hackers had non-public information as well. That's the one main one that we have seen so far. We're worried about one other thing, though, John. There's a Russian group that some people call Energetic Bear, which has long hacked into energy systems, power grids, and so forth. And that's also a subject that we take up in the documentary. But about 2 months ago, DHS noticed that they had turned their attention away from the power grids and were going after those state and local governments and that infrastructure. Now, so far, we've seen no direct hit on voting systems. There were two, one in California, one in Indiana, neither of which are battleground states. We know how those are going to turn out. Looks like those were just sort of incidental casualties of the attack. But the big question is, could this set them up to move laterally on election day? And that's why the next, 100 hours are going to be pretty critical in this regard, and why we've at the Times deployed so many reporters to so many different places.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. And, when we first started this project, I don't know, 14, 16 months ago, the thing that struck me was the volume of attacks and how they've grown. It really was, it's kind of remarkable. And we, in the film, as you and I discussed a lot, and if anybody's interested in the audience, to be able to adapt, a book with the level of reporting that it contains, you realize what a blunt instrument a documentary film actually is. You're trying to go for the emotion, trying to go for that. But did you feel, and I'm going to put you on the spot, but were there parts of the book that you wish we could have done more with in the film, just given the pure volume? I know you and I worked tirelessly to pick out those ones that were emblematic of the bigger story, right? Like the Sony hack and those things. But
well, John, you were extremely patient with me during all of this because, the author of a 300+ page book turned over to your good hands. One of the first things you think is, well, we've got all this great stuff in here, not all of which, of course, as you would periodically remind me, lends itself to great video. Okay. And something I think you did quite brilliantly. I remember you were up here at our house here in Vermont summer before last, summer of 2019. And you said, you know, I think the way to humanize this story is to focus first on the victims. And that wasn't really something that I had done. You know, I was there to describe the geopolitics of states adopting this weapon. And so, yeah, there are things that I wish we could have done more. You know, there's a lot in the book about what we've learned about deterrence. How do you stop states from doing this? And it's a very different problem than the deterrence we knew in the nuclear age, when there was really only one major competitor, the Soviet Union, and we knew where all their weapons were and we knew who could launch them. The cyber world's entirely different. States have them, terrorists have them, criminal groups have cyber weapons, and teenagers have cyber weapons. And since I know who's home in your household, I know your teenagers are not likely to sign on to treaties on these issues. And I know the ones in my house when they were teenagers wouldn't have either. But those are the things that, you know, are better dealt with in a book than a documentary. But let me turn this back to you. Tell me why you concluded so quickly that we had to tell this story from the victim's point of view.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Mostly, to be honest, because the people who perpetrate these attacks are just sort of, it's very difficult to portray them other than, you know, as we joke about, shadowy figures with wearing hoodies in the back rooms of you know, in the alleyways of Beijing and in Moscow and various places that we weren't necessarily going to get access to. And it's frankly, it's a story, it becomes a story about ones and zeros, which is what we talked a lot about, which is just not interesting. What interests me in all my films, the hallmark of all my work, is making an emotional impact with the audience. And I thought, well, initially, like, my first instinct was, well, who are the casualties in this cyber war? Who are they? You know, we talked a lot about, many of us have gotten a letter in the mail from Equifax or our bank that has been sort of part of the hack and letting us know that some of our information has been stolen. I think we're conditioned in a way to understand a part of this kind of war, but not on the big state-sponsored level, and not also on the sort of the theater. You know, how our adversaries actually talk to each other and they learn from each other. And once you kind of sort of put that puzzle together, I knew there was the architecture, a narrative for a story about the beginnings of the cyber war and where we are today. And what I thought the great sort of like way to tell the story was to meet the people who were the sort of, you know, were in the middle of it, but never really understood that story. And Seth Rogen was one of the first people we thought of reaching out to because of his role in the Sony hack. Here was a guy who thought he was going to make a sort of farce, you know, make a comedy about a very farcical character. And suddenly, without his knowing, he became part of an international incident, which put, you know, one of our most revered presidents really on the spot. And you see it, you know, you see him, President Obama in the briefing room, just really not having a good answer about how to respond to this attack, you know, calling it an act of cyber vandalism or whatever. And there's Seth Rogen, you know, this guy suddenly, he's not going to see his script, his movie play. They're pulling it from theaters. And what's the response? You know, what do we do? Again, uniquely sort of vulnerable to that kind of attack, the sort of hack and dump attack. And then, you know, then to sort of stitch that together and see what happens to John Podesta in 2016, just 2 years later. All of that just came home to me. That, and you see it in John Podesta in the films, he describes, you know, the phishing attack that sort of drew him in and became one of the very first casualties in the war on our democracy in 2016. And so I just thought, as I met more of those characters, I realized like that was the right approach, that to humanize this as much as possible in the process of setting the table, so we kind of understood the battle space that we're talking about. And then, of course, you know, your ability to sort of stitch it together with new reporting constantly was just, you know, made the process of updating the film a lot easier, because you're very much on the job. But one of this is a good time, David, actually to turn to something that people I have found since the film came out have found very interesting, which is the fact that we sort of, you know, we were the shot across the bow, that America sort of opened this box So I think maybe we should turn and see a clip from the beginning of the film about exactly America's role in starting this cyber war.
As we began to hear about this incredibly sophisticated piece of code that the industry was calling Stuxnet, I began to reconstruct the story of who authorized this code to be written.
Neither Israel nor the U.S. have publicly admitted that this was designed by them.
You did that without at all mentioning Stuxnet or Olympic Games. That was impressive.
I never heard of those.
Can you talk about Stuxnet?
No.
It's years ago. That one thing that missed.
I don't want to talk about it, okay?
It's just it's a mystery.
I don't want to talk about it. Let me know if I'm being too subtle, okay?
This is the first worm designed to damage the physical world. It's a new dimension in sabotage and warfare.
The implications and the possible consequences are only now coming to light.
The Stuxnet attack on Iran was the first time a major state used a powerful cyber weapon in a very aggressive way.
You know, it's fascinating, David, and I don't think we've ever really gotten into, between you and I, like how you piece that together. I mean, what were, if you can, in sort of broad strokes,
Sure.
what were the major players? Who was telling you this information?
So I had written a book that Harold referred to briefly in our intro called Confront and Conceal. It came out just as The Inheritance came out just as President Obama was coming in, and then Confront and Conceal came out at the end of his first term. And these two books had a common theme in them. In The Inheritance, I had described, which came out in January of 2009, I had described how President Bush, in leaving office, had authorized the United States to begin what I referred to as computer-based attacks on the Iran nuclear program. But we didn't know any details about it. And he did this in part to keep the Israelis from actually bombing what were at the time sort of a nascent nuclear program, underground program in Iran that everybody knew about, but President Bush was afraid if they bombed, it would start another world war in the Middle East. He had already had a few of those going. And his hope was that by engaging the Israelis in a different kind of way to paralyze the program, he might actually keep them from dropping bombs. And then in the summer of 2010, a little more than 2 years, a little more than a year and a half after President Obama was in, we began to see some code get out around the world that people quickly called Stuxnet. And the more we pulled apart this code, the more we sort of found its DNA. One of the things I learned traveling to Europe and talking to people who were looking at it was that it was designed to attack groups of 164 machines. Seems like a strange thing to do. But I knew from years of covering the Iranian nuclear program that the Iranians gathered their centrifuges in groups of 164. So when I saw that in the code, I knew right away what the target was. And later on, an American official said to me, you know, that was sort of the key sort of insight that blew their cover about what was going on. There were other hints in it as well. The code expired after a certain number of years. Teenagers, when they're writing malicious software, don't put sell-by dates into their software. Lawyers do. And so it was pretty clear who those lawyers might have worked for. So there were hints like that. And I just went back and started pulling on the thread and got to this remarkable story about how Bush handed this to Obama. Obama went into the Situation Room, having run for president, talking about cyber defense and protecting ourselves, and suddenly finds himself running Operation Olympic Games, which was one of the biggest classified programs we had going, and one the US still has not admitted to. When President Obama's memoir appears in later November, I don't expect to read a whole lot about Olympic Games. In fact, I doubt he'll even mention it. And that was the beginning of the telling of that story. It took 14 months to report it out. And this is one of the advantages you have when you're working for a largely print and internet-based news operation. You don't have to put everybody in front of a camera, because I was able to get people to go talk to us along this on. So that was the beginnings of that whole tale. And as you described so well in the film, this was the opening shot, because as Obama said to his staff, every country that's already attacking us or wants to attack us is going to use the fact that the United States is engaged in cyber warfare to justify their own attacks, even if they're not quite as limited in them.
You know, it's interesting too, and I would like for us, just for the audience, to kind of understand who our main adversaries are in this world. I know, you know, one of the obvious advantages is that this is a weapon that is cheap, it's asymmetrical. You know, so even countries for whom are under crippling economic sanctions, they can put together a few guys with some laptops and generate some pretty devastating code. And as
a little pizza and a little Red Bull helps as well.
Yeah,
keep those guys awake, you know.
Exactly. But I wanted to talk about China because China was a big revelation to me. Just the sort of distinct nature in which they operate in the cyber world, which I think is fascinating, which largely had been intellectual property theft. I mean, and I wonder if you could talk about that threat and how it's kind of morphed. What we deal with in the film is that they also have been learning from Russia and others about new forms of cyber warfare. So we've seen them go from the Anthem insurance hacks, the OPM hacks, where they got all of this incredible information, could draw very personal pictures of many Americans, their backgrounds, their likes, their tastes, their travel habits, their mistresses, all that kind of stuff. But they've seen now with coronavirus to kind of take it into a new sort of more dangerous direction. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what's going on current with that.
Well, you know, what we've learned about cyber is that countries use it to pursue the foreign policy and national security policy that they were pursuing in the real world. And it comes to replicate that. So if you think about the Russians, in the real world, they're primarily disruptors, right? They don't have the money or the power to build much anymore. They've got nuclear weapons, which make them, I guess, a superpower, but it's not something they can use every day. So cyber becomes a new form of disruption that they can dial up and dial down, and they can use every day, right? And so that's why you saw the cyber attacks against Estonia in 2007, Georgia in 2008, and of course against Ukraine, which we refer to in the documentary and I refer to in the book as Putin's petri dish, the place that he goes to test all this out. So as one senior official in the NSA put it so well, and I'm sure he's not the only one to have said this, Russia's the hurricane, China is climate change. And that is to say that the Chinese are not out to disrupt. They're out to do two things: steal the stuff that they need that they don't think they can invent fast enough. So 10 years ago, as you showed so well in the film, that was the F-35, right? The stealth fighter. But this year, it's the coronavirus vaccine. The other thing the Chinese have done so well, though, is figure out how to build the infrastructure that will make sure that they're in command of the system in 5 or 10 or 15 years. Because if you think about it, the lines that connect all of us together, the undersea cables, the satellite systems, they've really been American dominated since Alexander Graham Bell laid his first telephone wires across the Atlantic. And the Chinese have basically said, okay, we've had it with that. So Huawei and the rollout of 5G technology, the 5th generation networks, is partly about creating a new internet infrastructure, one that can connect factories together over cellular lines and so forth. but it's also about creating a moment for the Chinese through their national champion, Huawei, to build infrastructure in countries that may not be allied with China yet, but which they love to begin to pull back from the West. And so they show up in places like Hungary and say, you know, we'll give you the low-cost loan to build the 5G network. And by the way, if you buy it, we'll throw in our surveillance system that we've been using in Hong Kong, so you can identify the dissidents by facial recognition, run it through this 5G network, and we'll help you make sure that you maintain control.
5G is, I mean, I think people need to understand. I mean, it is going to be, it's the superhighway of the future, right? I mean, driverless cars, everything that we own already is running. Our refrigerators tell us when we're out of milk and all that kind of stuff. And that was a real eye-opening thing for me, was how much we're going to rely on 5G and how much the Chinese can undercut American and European manufacturing lane of this cable, because they make their money in China and then they go to the rest of the world and say, we'll do it for half the price of the European competitors. But we don't really seem to even have a dog in the fight, though. I mean, who is the 5G on the American side? Who's going to be laying this cable and rewiring the world? It seems like we got caught on our heels a little bit.
We gave up a lot of these because they did not, the switching systems that are used in big internet switches are not an especially profitable business. We dominated it for a while, sold it off. The Europeans still have some competitors, Nokia and Ericsson. And a lot of discussion has taken place during the Trump administration, much needed conversation, about trying to merge them up with some American capital and maybe some American chip making capability. Because so far what President Trump's approach to this has been to wall off Huawei, right? Just say, you're not going to sell in the United States. And then try to threaten the Europeans by saying, if you buy their equipment, we're cutting off your access to American intelligence. Well, first of all, didn't do great things for transatlantic relations. But secondly, it's not a strategy over the long term that's going to work, because even if you block Huawei from all of the West's major markets, given the size of China, the number of places they've wired up in Asia, their penetration in Latin America and Africa, they're going to have 40% or more of the market. And that's a lot of the market. And it means that when I'm sending an email to you, John, it may be routing through a country that China controls. More importantly, the Chinese will have control over the hardware and software, which means that if they got into a conflict, they could cut it off. That's why it was so worrisome a year ago when Italy signed on with Huawei. Italy, as you'll recall, is a NATO member. And what would happen if the NATO communications, at least the commercial communications, the day-to-day stuff, was beginning to run through a Chinese network? And that was kind of the wake-up call we saw. And we probably would have been able to portray a little bit more in the film had it not been for the fact that coronavirus kept us from that lovely European tour you and I were going to take.
It's true. I mean, we have big plans. You know, it's funny, the original vision for this film had us in China, had us in Moscow, in Ukraine, I think in Estonia for a second, Hamburg, Italy, and then
we were going to drink in some pretty great places.
I think we were going to go to Vietnam for a second, and our best laid plans were thwarted by this pandemic. But it speaks to something. You know, what's interesting is the stakes in this film. Like early on, when we talked about was that, you know, you've always referred to this war as short of war in a way, right? Because have there been human casualties? Some very big companies have lost a tremendous amount of money. Some egos have been bruised. Democracy was threatened. There's no question. We're on the precipice. But what worries me, you know, a little bit about 5G is that idea of, you know, will someday, you know, soon, if I have a driverless car, could somebody get in and just decide to muck that up and drive me into a wall, or an attack on our critical infrastructure or air traffic control or something like that. It seems like we're not far. I mean, again, I don't want to overstate it, but do you think, what does that possibility look like in the near future of of cyber war becoming something much more critical in that regard?
Well, so far, as you said, we haven't really had cyber war. We've had low-level cyber conflict. And, you know, the comparison I've used, John, and you probably heard me say this too many times, is it's not really to nuclear weapons. It's to the development of air power in the early part of the 20th century. So in 1909, you know, the Wright brothers show up with a bunch of Army generals, and they show them the military flyer. And people first looked at it and said, wow, this is a terrific surveillance device. We'll fly up over the enemy lines. We'll see where the holes are. We'll send in the cavalry. They never actually thought about arming the thing, right? But very quickly, by World War I, you know, we were dropping bombs, and, you know, the Red Baron was flying around doing dogfights.
Right.
It wasn't a strategic weapon. I mean, World War I would have ended the same way and around the same time had we not had any air power at all. But within 20 years, it was, of course, a strategic weapon. And in World War II, it was completely decisive, and that technology got merged with the dropping of the atomic bomb. If you think about cyber, we're kind of at the end of World War I. We've had a few skirmishes. We have a bunch of things we're worried about. People have looked up in the air and said, wow, that's new, but it hasn't been a decisive weapon. And I think part of what we're doing in The Perfect Weapon is getting people to think about what could happen when it does become a strategic weapon, because it will.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wonder if now is a good time for us to turn to some questions from the audience, and happy to answer all. Mac, if you want
David and John. Hello. This
Hey,
is
Mac.
Fantastic. So we do have one more clip to show that I think nicely encapsulates the escalation of cyber conflict and sort of lets us know what the scale of the threat is. And I thought maybe we could show that before we go to the audience Q&A, and then I'll go to the question that refers to it.
Great.
The evolution of cyber has happened very quickly in terms of its importance to the United States and the organizational dimension of it in the US government. In 2007, the Director of National Intelligence issues his threat assessment of all the threats against the country. The word cyber isn't in it a single time. Fast forward just a couple of years, you have the creation of Cyber Command. Fast forward a couple more years, it's 2012. Suddenly, cyber has gone from not being mentioned at all in those threat assessments to being one of the top 3 threats facing the United States. Secretary of Defense Panetta goes on board the Intrepid, which is an aircraft carrier museum. I think the background is not a coincidence, and talks about a cyber Pearl Harbor.
We know that foreign cyber actors are probing America's critical infrastructure networks. They are targeting the computer control systems that operate chemical, electricity, and water plants, and those that guide transportation throughout this country.
So our first question from the audience, I think, is a good way to move on from that clip. This is from an anonymous questioner. The anonymous questioner asks, is there an effective way to insulate critical infrastructure systems from cyber attacks, or is there ultimately always a way around safeguards?
It's a great question, Mac. So, you know, for a while, people suggested maybe our critical infrastructure should run on a completely different system, that we should basically build an internet just for critical infrastructure. Not just virtually set it off, but lay our own cables, you know, have basically the equivalent of what the Pentagon does with its own GPS system or with its own communication systems. The difficulty is that this is so spread out and across so much of the private sector that it would be a huge construction operation, and it's unclear who would want to go pay for this, right? So far, nobody's found a way to do this except by connecting these through the commercial internet and trying to build better firewalls, better protections, and so forth along the way. I think what we've learned is that if you're willing to go invest extremely heavily, as the utility industry has and as the financial industry has, you can build pretty good protections. You know, it's not an accident that we haven't had that super hack that turns off all the lights between Boston and Washington, or between Seattle and LA. Partly it's because those industries have built up pretty well in their defenses. But partly also it's because our adversaries have recognized that that would be an act of war. It would go above that invisible red line that could get you visited by B-2 bombers. And so far what we have seen are the short of war attacks, similar to what I just described about the election, where people are testing the system, doing low-level stuff, attacking Sony, attacking the Sands Casino, going after our records, of classification in of people with clearances at the Office of Personnel Management, but judging for each one, will this lead to a military response? And if the answer is no, they go ahead. And the problem we've had so far is we haven't raised the price enough so that they would feel that they could get retaliated against.
Yeah, I would just like to add, I do think, you raised an interesting question in the film about just also, there are conventions, there are restrictions. We've agreed as a world for certain guardrails around conventional warfare, the Geneva Conventions and things like that. And I do wonder if it's time that this gets to that level of understanding, because it's not, short of the critical infrastructure kind of attacks, it is these perception hacks that are just as devastating to certain countries, especially countries like ours, that to your point, David, like what is the red line? When do we stop and say, and also just how do you combat it? I mean, we're watching, the last couple of weeks and Twitter's response to the New York Post story. They were trying to be proactive or trying to understand whatever their methods are, that the media implication in this confuses this picture, our sense of how we defend against these kinds of attacks even more. That's why it really is like when when we talked about what we should call this film, A Perfect Weapon really sums it up. It's like it binds you so much. And the more you struggle to get out of it, the more you seem sort of tied up in it.
That's right.
And it's remarkable in that regard.
It's not only because it's cheap, as you pointed out, and it's not only because 35 or 40 nations can do sophisticated attacks, but it's because you can dial it up and dial it down the way we were just talking about. You can't do that with nuclear weapons, right? It either goes off or it doesn't. But cyber weapons are really on a thermostat. And, we can make this pain high or we can make this pain low. So far, it's interesting that the Russians have decided to sort of keep it on the low side during the election.
Yeah.
Susan Weisfield recalls that 60 Minutes talked about China and cybersecurity at least 10 years ago. And she asks, why hasn't the government taken cyber more seriously?
Well, there are a lot of parts of the US government that do take it pretty seriously now. I mean, the problem is it's so spread out. The Department of Homeland Security has something that's very active in the election space called CISA, the Computer Security and Infrastructure Security Agency. The US government, the military has raised US Cyber Command to be a full command, the way Central Command takes care of the Middle East, Space Command takes care of space, Cyber Command takes care of cyberspace. The difficulty, I think, is twofold, Mac. First, 85% of the computer traffic, internet traffic in the United States runs through private entities. And not every private entity wants the federal government, including the IRS or the military, inside their networks. In fact, most of them don't. The second big problem is nobody could afford to have the US government provide all of the protection here. So the question is, what is it for private industry to protect, and where is that magic line where the US government protects? So, think of this in terms of our own homes. We put locks on the door. We have alarm systems. That's to filter out 85% of the sort of ordinary crime that goes by, right? Make it a little bit harder, cause some friction in the system. But no one is thinking that their locks on their doors or their security systems are going to help them if an ICBM is headed toward their city from a foreign nation. For that, we turn to the US government to do the protection. We understand that line pretty clearly. We don't understand it in cyber.
And I do think, David, we always joke about this, and it's a story I've told many times, but, when I was polling people, friends of mine, before COVID, when we had dinner parties, and I'd ask people if they'd ever heard of Cyber Command. We have a whole unit of government, very secretive unit of government. It's not the NSA. We thought we understood everything about the top secret stuff after the Snowden revelations, but there's a whole command run by a general, Nakasone, who recruits what he calls cyber warriors, cyber patriots, And so I was interestingly very sort of instantly surprised by that, and also like what the future of our military is going to look like in this kind of asymmetrical war. Are we still looking for grunts and boots on the ground, or are we looking for the smartest and brightest coders that are going to fight our future wars? And it was interesting to contemplate.
Yeah, the answer is yes. Although I think we should say to our audience that we gave Cyber Command every opportunity to go participate in the documentary. And it's interesting that they chose not to, and knowing that it would come out just before the election.
Barry Bloom has a question that picks up on that. He asks, how can the US government attract the brightest cybersecurity minds in light of the poor salaries and government political interventions and competition from a very lucrative private industry?
Great question. And the answer is, you can get people, particularly when they're young, because they can do things inside Cyber Command that they'd go to jail for if they did it in private industry. Okay, so let me give you an example. I described before how Cyber Command was getting inside this Russian-speaking hacking and ransomware group called TrickBot. TrickBot really names the tools that they're using. You can't do that working for Google or Microsoft or something like that, right? You need the authorities that the president has given to Cyber Command and to the NSA to be able to go do that. You get the best education that you could possibly get into the insides of the development of malware, how people break into systems, how we break into foreign systems, how they break into us. It's the kind of training that you would get if you were a fighter pilot and you were flying around for the Air Force. And then at some point in your career, you say, I've got a mortgage and a few kids and all that. It really would be a good time to become a commercial aircraft pilot. And that's usually what happens with Cyber Command, that people work there up until their early mid-30s, and then they settle into a stage of life where they can command a pretty good salary if they've been at the upper reaches. The real hard part for Cyber Command is getting the superstars, right? I mean, as with every industry, there are some people who are just 5 times better at this than everybody else. And so, how do you find the John Maggios of the cyber world who are not only good at the basics, but also are phenomenal artists along the way.
And there's also a conflict too, right? I mean, with the leading engineers who in Silicon Valley who don't want to be part of the military-industrial complex, the way maybe they had in the past, the Raytheons and the building of our conventional weaponry. There's been many instances where they've boycotted sharing technology and those sorts of things. It's been interesting to watch what you just mentioned about TrickBot, to see that Microsoft, essentially NSA and Cyber Command, they know about a number of vulnerabilities that they hold on to, easy entrance to Microsoft systems. If you don't patch your computer, that you'll get. And it's interesting that public-private cooperation is been interesting to see it growing closer to me a little bit, maybe. I don't know the extent to which they're sharing information and sharing patches It's tricky, but it's something we talked about in the to David a lot about the secrecy of all of this stuff, which complicates things too. And you know, I don't know, but I found it interesting very early on to hear Nakasone talk about wanting to recruit these people, as the Chinese do. The Chinese pluck them out of kindergarten, you know, and I think
And Israel does this from sort of, high school on. They go identify people who are going to go into Unit 8200, which is their sort of military and intelligence cyber unit, the one that did Stuxnet with the United States.
Yeah.
Are you okay to do a couple more?
Sure.
Yeah.
So Artie Friedman asks, do you think that the problem of cyber warfare would have happened anyway, even if the US hadn't started it?
Yes, absolutely. And it had begun, particularly with intellectual property theft, before we did Stuxnet. But you have to think of a different kind of category. Stuxnet was not just about stealing data so that we could learn the inside of, it wasn't just surveillance, what intelligence agencies have done forever. It was using cyber to do what otherwise you could only do by bombing a facility or by sending in saboteurs. And that's really the cutting edge. That's really the edge that I've spent much of the past 10 years studying, which is how do you use cyber to bring about real, either physical or political effects in the real world? And that's what Stuxnet did. And that's what it really legitimized. Now, would we have gotten there anyway? Absolutely. Were there some reports of things like that happening before? Yeah, as far back as the 1980s, there were signs that the Russians and the Soviets actually had used some computer code to destroy an oil pipeline. It's never been entirely clear if that's quite how they did it. But Olympic Games, the code name for the operation against Iran, took us into a whole new world. And once that code got out there, everyone who was in this business could look at it, pick it apart, pick out pieces of it that they could repurpose and shoot it back at us.
And I'll combine two questions into a final question. Barbara Schotzow says, this all sounds pretty horrifying. Is there any positive way to look toward the future for democracies? And then I think to go along with that, Ruth Stevens, if there's a new administration, what are the key initiatives that they should take up to help us maintain our tech advantage and reduce the risk of these various cyber threats?
John, why don't you take the first and I'll take the second?
Oh, it does seem awfully bleak, doesn't it? I mean, I as always, am drawn to, the disinformation stuff, which I do feel like that's the trickiest part for me, because we want to be able to have a free and open society. But we also don't want to live in this wilderness of mirrors. And I think what I do in the film, and it's not an indictment, but it's more sort of putting a little bit of the spotlight on the media's responsibility in the way they cover the sort of disinformation attacks, the way they cover rhetoric coming from politicians, the way they cover, what we see in the film, the evolution of the Russian playbook, to not just use Russian bots and trolls, but to recruit what they call useful idiots in America to do their bidding. It's very tricky to root that out. Social media and the openness is at our core. It's who we are, and the fight that I see coming up is one between whether or not we go back to a more curated media environment. I don't know if that's even possible or wanted, but that's really for me where the battle's was gonna be. Where I am hopeful, but what I am hopeful about is the curative properties of a president who doesn't stoke it, for a president who doesn't push disinformation, for a president who doesn't call the elections rigged unless he wins. I think that rhetoric, should someone like Biden get into office, will help tamp down and bring the temperature down a bit in the cyber disinformation part of things. But it's here to stay, I think. I think as David says in the film, we've been let out of the box, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with it.
Well, John's right. We're not going to stuff this back in the box. There are a few things we can do. So on the disinformation side, I think the way you've seen at least mainstream media handle the past few weeks. Not been perfect by any means. We've all made a lot of mistakes, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of interesting after action reports. But it's been a lot better than 2016, right? And we're now running in the Times this great item called the Daily Disinfo, right? Just an example to give people of what disinformation looks like day by day, to raise the awareness, raise the sensitivity. So that's one thing. Second, the Trump administration got going the right way in the first year and a half with two quite good White House officials who were sort of the White House coordinators for all of this. John Bolton fired them both when he came in as national security advisor, and the jobs have never been restored. But boy, what we've learned from this is we really need that coordination. The third thing we've learned along the way is that it's not just enough to build up good defenses any more than it would be good enough to go think that you could protect the country with missile defense alone. If you aren't on the offense, if you aren't in the foreign networks each and every day, if you aren't watching what's happening there so you can act preemptively, you're never going to catch up with this. Because by the time an attack begins to unfold in the United States, you've got maybe a 30th of a second to hold a meeting and decide what to go do. Not likely to work. So the concept that has really flourished in the Trump administration under General Nakasone, which some people call active defense, some people call persistent engagement, that is going to continue no matter who gets elected on Tuesday. And you could argue that at moments that's escalatory, right? That the more we're in foreign networks, the more they're going to come in and be in our networks. But they're in our networks anyway. So the trick after we've all shown that we can be in each other's networks is whether we can all show that we can begin to negotiate about what's off limits. And the place I'd start with this, John, is a concept that Brad Smith of Microsoft has brought about, which is basically a way to have a digital Geneva Convention. And like your films, the Geneva Convention focuses on the victims, right? It says, we don't turn off the electric power in a non-wartime because there are people in hospitals and nursing homes and shut into their houses who are going to die. Maybe we'd all agree that we're not going to mess with election systems because we want to preserve the tenet of an American democratic system. But let's face it, we're going to run into more than a few objections to that. And some of those objections are going to be from the US intelligence community because they've got a weapon that they don't want to give up right now and they don't want to see limits on it. So we're going to have to figure that out as well. And that's going to be a big challenge for the next president.
Well, John David, thank you so much for these important insights on this critical topic. This has been really excellent. And before we sign off, if you have any final thoughts before we do that.
I just want to thank John for turning this into such an engrossing thriller type documentary, which is a great honor for somebody who writes, pretty nerdy books.
And David, I want to thank you for trusting me to tell the story. I know, the level of reporting and that's not even just about reporting, because people can report, but your ability to tie it all together. Your mind is so expansive. It's been amazing. It's been such a learning experience for me. And so I thank you for trusting me with your baby.
Thank you.
Well,
both.
thanks, Butch. Thanks, Mac.
Yes, thanks for everybody who joined. Good night.
Good night.